Thank you very much, Frederick. I won't be original here at all. I mean, at all, the whole time. But especially in the beginning, and I will have to thank all the organizers for all the efforts that have been doing in order to put this beautiful conference together and this happy environment in which we can talk and collaborate with at least, and I will speak about me, a lot of my philosophical superheroes are here. So thanks for that to everybody, and especially to the organizer. Thank you very much. And also, I will set my timer here. So well, I will talking about this controversial question about the impasse in discussions on scientific realism and the prospects of developing a kind of collaborative epistemology and find some shared ground between the realist and the realist stances. I wasn't planning to say a lot about this kind of stalemate or impasse. Besides just like point out that it has been mentioned in the literature. But considering a lot of things that we were discussing yesterday, I will just say two quick things. The first one is that with the idea of an impasse or a stalemate, as I was suggesting yesterday in the Q&A of one of the talks, I don't mean to imply that the debate is kind of paralyzed or there hasn't been any movement or new arguments or not even lack of progress. I do believe that in many ways that perhaps we have to measure progress in philosophical debates, the debate on scientific realism has shown progress. What I do mean, and it's what I take to be the core issue that all these people in this slide are trying to point out, is that there is a kind of core disagreement that we have been not able to overcome, and that perhaps that for the very nature of the disagreement, or perhaps because of the nature of the position in the agreement, we cannot expect to overcome that disagreement. So that's the core idea. And secondly, and perhaps not that importantly, but still important, I don't take this to be something exceptional, something that happens in scientific realism and sharply in scientific realism. On the contrary, I think that these kinds of disagreements that I will try to identify today are all across philosophy. It doesn't mean, of course, that every philosophical disagreement is like this, but they are all across philosophy. I'm especially interested in this one mainly because of the topic of the conference. So we have just two quotations that perhaps we have time to read during my speech, and a lot more references saying something about this allegedly stalemate or impasse. So what I will try to do is just to put forward and perhaps try to answer just very simple questions. The first is why is it happening? And the second is what do we do from now on? And well, like spoiler alert, the answers are not supposed to be that complicated either. So to the first question, I first, step one, try to reconstruct the debate in terms of epistemic stances or perhaps perspectives that are not to be believed but adopted, more or less the framework that Anshan was describing in his wonderful talk. So given that reconstruction, that of course can be contested in many ways, given that reconstruction, I will suggest that at least some disagreements within scientific ontology, perhaps those that are relevant for the scientific realism debate, could be better understood as instances of what in social epistemology is often called deep disagreements. And if that's the situation, the other question remains, what do we do from here? And I would like to pick up as a suggestion, actually by Anderson, of the development of a kind of collaborative epistemology that acknowledge that I have called the impasse and foster an open discussions on the conditions for stance adoption. And perhaps more importantly, I would like to motivate a distinction between two approaches to this collaborative epistemology that I will label as adversarial and non-adversarial approaches. And these are, of course, like a bunch of nice words, collaboration and non-adversariality and cooperation, but I will try to put some flesh in these bones with an example. And that example, I will try to draw it from a side discussion on scientific understanding. In particular, I will try to motivate the idea that one thing that we can do in this non-adversarial approach is to focus on a kind of middle ground or shared space of epistemic aims and goals. One of them possibly being scientific understanding. And for that, I will rely on quasi-factist theories of scientific understanding. So that's the menu for today, the complete menu. I have told enough about the impasse, so let's move to epistemic stances in scientific methodology. Well, as I said, I can rely a lot on what Ancient said about stances, this kind of framework like cluster of values, aims, perhaps principles that determines which propositions within scientific ontology are really at. So there are other notions similar, e-system, framework, epistemic perspective that I have entertained, perhaps in a slightly different sense of Sandy. But the core idea is always the same, and the upshot is that we can reconstruct the debate on scientific realism as the clash between the empiricist stance on the one hand and the metaphysical stance in the other. In previous work, I have developed this framework of epistemic perspective. I don't believe that there is anything special about this framework at all, except for the fact that it was designed particularly to deal with arguments within social epistemology. So I think that almost everything that I can say now about epistemic perspectives can be translated into the framework of stances, perhaps with a minor adaptation. We can discuss about that. But the core idea of this framework is that epistemic perspectives is a set of policies that represents the maximum irrational doxastic attitudes among belief or suspicion belief towards a proposition as a function of the available evidence, principles, and an ordered hierarchy of epistemic values and some preferred epistemic goals. And there are two features that are attributed to these perspectives. The first is fundamentality, and there's the idea that there is no higher level perspective that can use to evaluate the ground level perspective. Are you getting to see the? It's okay. And perhaps one side, but still important note, is that this fundamentality it's taken to be domain relative. It's not something absolute. And closely tied to fundamentality is the idea of immodesty. This is just that perspectives always estimate themselves as least as good as the other candidates, the other perspective, the other alternatives. So, in a very idealized and perhaps simplistic reconstruction, we can reconstruct the debate on scientific realism. This is one of the debates crucial to scientific realism in terms of the clash between those perspectives, with the core principles being the rejection or demands of explanation of observable phenomena in terms of underlying observable phenomena, or the acceptance of the demands. And of course, the central values will be contestable, but they are going to be closer to parsimony, perhaps simplicity in the case of empiricism, and without doubt, explanatory powers is going to be one of the stars of the hierarchy of values in the metaphysical realm. So everybody would be on board with the idea that we should believe what is true and not believe what is false. But I think there is a kind of difference of emphasis in what is more important within that epistemic option. And it can translate into more liberal or restrictive epistemic policies. And of course, the aim of science, and perhaps even the very insightful discussions that we were having yesterday, regarding contrasting ideas, perhaps if one should identify constructed empiricism, it's just this block. Constructing empiricism is the aim of science is just empiricism. Perhaps in other presentations, something more in the other problems. This was the presentation of the overall framework, and let's move to the disagreement, which are part of my answer to the first question. And this disagreement is a very well-known notion in the field of the epistemology of disagreement, presented mainly by Robert Fogelin in the context of discussions in informal logic. And Fogelin idea is that these deep disagreements are simply impossible to overcome by rational means. That's the core idea. And of course, the literature developed, and a lot of people tried to identify what, in lack of a better word, I will call like superficial, phenomenological features of the disagreement that I think that we can easily recognize in the scientific realism debate. Genuine disagreement is not a misunderstanding among the parties. Reason sensitive, the parties are sensitive to other parties' reasons. The disagreement is not about an isolated proposition, but a systematic disagreement. And it's, of course, a persistent disagreement. It's 40 years and counting, and we are here discussing the same things. And one of the features, I would say not that superficial feature, is indivisibility. And it's the idea that resolution through rational means it's impossible or nearly impossible. And that connects with the good old Fogelin idea of being impossible or very hard to resolve. And these like superficial features of the disagreement are connected to what one of the leading theories on the field take to be fundamental epistemic principles or disagreements about fundamental epistemic principles. And of course, we can say a lot of fundamental epistemic principles, but the key feature is that we can not offer reasons for those principles without employing either the principle itself or at least the source of epistemic confidence that the principle recommend as reliable. So in this sense, epistemic principles are also immodest in the same sense that I was telling perspectives are immodest. So, of course, the indivisibility of the disagreement in the case of the scientific realism debate, it should be accounted for, presupposed. So it is like a toy disagreement, like from both views. And I will, just for the sake of simplicity and eliminating possible confounders, assume that there is a case of disagreement between peers, more or less the people here are all peers. So we can ideally have like relations which are peers with respect to a proposition that is relevant for scientific ontology, and they hold divergent substantive attitudes toward that proposition. Let's say one believes P and the other suspends judgment about P. But they do so as a result of adopting rival epistemic perspective, to be the metaphysical and the empiricist perspective. So if this is actually a case of peer disagreement, the usual way to go is walk the conciliationist argument. And the usual conciliationist argument goes more or less in this way. The peers here are learning a new piece of higher order evidence. higher order in the sense that I was referring before, not the second order, like abstracted from scientific. It's higher order in the sense that it's not first order evidence that was available in the first round of the debate. And coming from disagreement with a peer itself. And that evidence can suggest that their evaluation of the first order evidence might have been irrational or perhaps inaccurate in other versions of the same argument. And of course, they should significantly revise the initial exhaustive attitude, lower the confidence in their beliefs, for example. So this argument presupposes two principles. The first one is independence, and the core idea is I cannot tell you wrong just because you disagree with me. I have to give independent reasons especially independent from the method that I used to reach my original result. And the second principle is uniqueness. And the idea is that there is only one maximally rational exhaustive attitude we have given a set of evidence. So, again, in previous work and dealing with this social epistemology and epistemology of disagreement issues, with a colleague, we introduced the idea of strong peer disagreement to resist this conciliationist argument. And the core idea here is that disagreement between peers, but peers that hold divergent epistemic perspectives with respect to an issue under this group can be seen as a case of strong peer disagreement. In that case, independence fails or falls, referred. Because given fundamentality and immodesty, the parties cannot, on the one hand, solve the disagreement by appealing to a shared background perspective, nor they can judge the merits of their rival view but from their own perspectives. So, what is rationally permissible here is to retain the original exhaustive attitude, to stick to your guns, to have an steadfast reaction, which is, funny enough, the technical term that is used in social epistemology. And steadfast reaction is the natural enemy of the conciliation argument. So, in this story example of scientific realist, discussing with peer, which would be as a anti-realist, if we read this as a case of strong peer disagreement, that is a disagreement arising from the adoption of two rival perspectives, we have indivisibility, and as a consequence of that, we can label this as a case of deep disagreement, in which it's rationally permissible to have a steadfast reaction. You are not obligated to conciliate. So we have more or less the elements to draw the answer to the first question. Disagreement arising from the adoption of the empiricist and the historical perspective, or standards, if you prefer. Since we are going to deep disagreement with the parties and rationally entitled to a steadfast reaction. So, what do we do now? That's the second question, and the second question we have a simple but I hope interesting answer. So there are many possible reactions to this scenario. One of that is it's adopt what it's called by Hope radical stance relativism. And the core idea is that adopting a stance is a matter of a lifestyle choice. It's like becoming, he said, a vegetarian because some animals are really cute and they feel like, oh, I don't like those animals. So it's absolutely immune to rational criticism. Van Frassen, the founding father of this debate, perhaps, is holding a more moderate and it's an optimistic answer. And of course, he's not referring to radical stance relativism, but entertaining that idea, he said, I cannot take that seriously. We need not to look far to see that rational discovery is possible for matter that touch our values, attitudes, and commitments. So I said, look around you, take part. Welcome to the real world. Now, the real world we discuss about religion, about politics, and if we can have rational discussion about those complicated matters, what can be that special in the case of scientific realism. It is important perhaps to us and not so many more people. Again, this is optimistic and in a way beautiful, but one could ask, what do I do in order to hold that rational debate? And I think there's a hint on that, on Einstein's doing for what he calls a collaborative epistemology that disappassionately examines stances and their underlying values. And of course, an epistemology that is built upon the recognition of what I call indexability. Of course, it's not completely new, and there has been some efforts that intentionally or perhaps unintentionally aim to the development of such epistemology. I myself try to discuss some strategies based on coherence and contextual success to motivate shifts in those attitudes in the framework of epistemic stances. And that thing about contextual success is perhaps not that distance to what Sandy and the parties call pragmatic justification, which is evaluation of realism and anti-realism based on the pragmatic benefits of adopting such stances, given some Asian relative goals and context. And this is great work. I mean, their work is great, mine is good. Their work is absolutely great. But I think that all these efforts have in common the fact that they attempt to provide a basis, perhaps not for to give definitive reasons to abandon instance and adopt another, but at least like rational motivation for local, partial, contextual, have even overall shift in stance adoption. So in that sense, they correspond to what I would call an adversarial approach to collaborative. And the idea of this talk, one of the main ideas of this talk, is to motivate development of a non-adversarial approach or approaches to collaborative epistemology. And of course, this is not a matter of choice, and not even favoring one approach over the other. In fact, the whole idea is inspired by Katarina Novaes' approach to adversariality and cooperation in argumentation. She says that the degree of adversariality or cooperations that we have to show in a argumentative situation is not internal, but dependent on background conditions, and also what she happened to think, to telloid associated with argumentation, epistemic levels, consensus building levels, conflict management levels. I won't go through all these details in the development of my view, but just give like a very programmatic list of tasks for the non-adversarial approach. And that it has, I believe, like the big risk of being unappealing and, in the end of the day, boring, because finding consensus between realist and anti-realist perhaps is a matter of saying, well, scientific realists and scientific and anti-realists, they love science. Yeah, or they love science. And they pay attention to evidence. Well, yeah, I mean, it's not yes, but it's yes and rolling eyes. Yeah, they pay attention to evidence. Yeah, so that's not new. But there could be some things that are not boring, not obvious, perhaps non-trivial in this non-adversarial. And this programmatic list of tasks, it's associated to some specific effort that we already have been made. What is it? What we can call shared commitments, common epistemic goals, values, principles that can serve as a ground of exchange. And I think that uniformitarianism and commiserability perhaps could be, placed in this kind of thing. And other things, find conversion zones, forcing agreement, conditional ontological commitments. This would try to find methodological practice or perhaps specific ontological commitments in which both stances can agree. And I think that about the Buenos and Tchaikovsky discussion on the adoption of modality, modalism in the realm of empiricism is kind of a good example. We scientific realists and we empiricists can agree that there is some true moral facts about the world. Last, what I call productive tension. So explore how the tension between the senses can be epistemically general. This is a huge list of texts, and I will just try to give a quick, and I hope interesting example of one point within the shared commitment realm, which is common epistemic goals or common epistemic aims. So we have learned a lot in these days that empiricists and realists project different aims in science. Empirical adequacy, approximately. But philosophers of science, we have been discussing other associated epistemic aims or epistemic goals for mainly. And among them is scientific understanding, who has gained a lot of popularity within the last year. So, of course, the issue is very complicated. I will try to summarize and idealize a lot here. But generally speaking, there are factist theories of understanding. And according to those theories, understanding is just a species of knowledge. And understand scientifically something is to be in the possession of a true explanation, scientific explanation of that issue. On the contrary, for contextualist theories of scientific understanding, understanding involves skills that are context-dependent and not necessarily related. Knowledge is not excluded, but also is not required. So, understanding is not factual. I will focus in these examples of each category. The explanation, knowledge, science models by Karim Khalifa, and the contextualist theory of Handler. And one of the reasons to choose these examples is that recently they have engaged in this exercise of philosophically collaborate, exchanging papers in an edited book, and trying to arrive to a common position, synthesis of both ideas. And the result of that exercise is what they call a quasi-factualist theory of scientific understanding. So, in order to be quick here, I will present first the common ground, the disagreement, and the resolution of disagreement. So, they agree in almost everything that is in this slide. Understanding something, a phenomenon, is to be in the possession of an adequate explanation of why it is the case that P is happening. And understanding that phenomenon happens if and only if there is some explanation, so that the agent believe that that explanation explained the phenomenon is safe. And safeness here is the result of a process that they call scientific explanatory evaluation, CE or something like that. And this is a three-stage process. Consideration of potential explanation, comparisons of those explanations on the basis of the best available methods and evidence, and if the problem, commitment to the explanation on the basis of that comparison. So up to this step, they completely agree, and here the disagreement starts. For both of them, commitment with an explanation involves being in possession of some skills that are relevant to the use of the explanation, to the intelligibility of the explanation, perhaps the intelligibility of the background theory of the explanation in specific terms. However, for contextualists, commitment involves intelligibility. It's just that the explanation E of P is based on an intelligible theory T, and both the explanation and the theory are empirically adequate and internally consistent. That's all. On the contrary, for the factivist model, commitment involves the belief in the approximate truth of that explanation. So here is the clash, here is the disagreement. And they both agree to concede something and produce this unified quasi-factual theory of scientific explanation. And that depends crucially on the adoption of what they call explanatory voluntarism. And the idea is for all phenomena and explanation, if it's true, the proposition that E adequately explains 3, then that explanation satisfies your preferred ontological requirement, just provided that they are reasonable. And reasonable is cashed out in terms of to be probabilistically coherence, not self-defeating, not much than that. So this leaves room for cases in which it's true that E adequately explained E, but E is not strictly true and perhaps not even approximately true. So the realist and irrealist can share judgments about cases in which science provides understanding while disagreeing on their preferred ontological, reasonable, let's say, requirements. And they've shown me this example with Newton's understanding of gravitational phenomena. So this natural intuition that Newton understood something about gravitational phenomena, and even if his theory was false or perhaps approximate to something like that. So explanatory voluntarism allows each party to retain their core principles and values regarding scientific ontology, while being more flexible in showing assessing cases of scientific understanding, specific cases of scientific. They need not to modify their preferred account of scientific explanation. At most, they have to adapt their view on how explanation and understanding connect. So, on the one hand, the realist should admit that misleading or perhaps false theories are, as well as idealized models or a hypothetical model or Darwin's model, whatever, can provide understanding. But this perfectly aligns with standard selective strategies that the realists have employed for many years. So the anti-realists, on the other hand, need not to drop their rejection of demands for explanation of observable phenomena in terms of observable person, but just merely to acknowledge that scientists' explanatory practices or activities can yield understanding of natural phenomena. So this not requires neither abandoning their critiques to inference-based explanation nor adopting any form of explanatory realism. So here's where the example ends. Brief conclusion, because 2 minutes of time. Some disagreement in scientific ontology can be seen as cases of deep disagreement when this steadfast reaction is pressured or needed. I hope to have motivated this distinction between non-adversarial and adversarial collaborative epistemology that could offer a productive alternative to adversarial approach to attempt to winning the debate and focusing instead on uncovering the shared epistemic ground in a non-boring and appealing way. I think that this quasi-factivist theory of scientific understanding could permit both the realists and the empiricists to pursue this shared epistemic goal without abandoning the core commitments of their senses. So this approach maybe shows how philosophical progress can occur through synthesis rather than victory, transforming seemingly intractable debates into opportunities for complementary science. It's a complicated way of saying non-adversarial approaches to collaborative epistemology can be not boring for something. And perhaps there are other things that collaborative epistemology could also do. Identify rational areas of conversion, develop pragmatic dialogue for stance adoption, and help foster productive tension that generates new philosophical insights. So that's all. Thank you very much.